In addition, Congress, most of the leaders of Congress, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, tended to come from slave states. In addition, even before, remember before the abolitionist movement, the people who were against slavery were Quakers, right? And the Quakers weren't really militantly against slavery. They didn't go protest. They didn't, advocate, rebellion or things like that. What they usually did was they just sent petitions to the floor of Congress that basically said, slavery is immoral, it's wrong, you should change it. And the way that Congress used to work up until the Missouri Compromise debate got so heated was that if a member of Congress, or if a constituent, a person who lived in a member of Congress's district, sent them a petition, the congressman, up till about the 1820s, felt honor bound to read it in front of Congress, even if they didn't agree with it. They just felt that was part of representing your constituents. And so you would go to the floor with the petition that your constituent had sent you, and you would read it. And everybody knew that doesn't necessarily mean you agree with it, but you're doing your duty as a representative of the people. Well, after the Missouri Compromise debate got so heated, and particularly after the Nat Turner Rebellion, Southern members of Congress insisted on a thing known as the gag rule, which was basically the banning of the reading of anti-slavery petitions on the floor of Congress. And it passed. Northern members of Congress ended up going along with it because Southerners threatened to basically grind Congress to a halt and not consider any bills or anything that the Northerners wanted to get done. And so they basically blackmailed Northern members of Congress. And so many people, particularly Democrats who believed in this thing called the money power conspiracy, and former Whigs, began to look at this and say, wait a sec. For being a minority in this country, slave owners seem to have an inordinate amount of power over our government. And then when something like the Kansas-Nebraska Act happened, or even the Compromise of 1850, where you have this fugitive slave law that favors the idea of finding that people are fugitive slaves even though they might not be, and then you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which completely gets rid of the Missouri Compromise and opens Kansas, which had always been considered to be a place that was going to be a free state, opens it up to the forces of slavery. There's something at work here. Something at work behind the scenes, and many of them had come to believe that the U.S. government was under the control of a conspiracy of slave owners who were running roughshod over the rights of everybody else. And so a new party of these disaffected Democrats and these former Whigs, Northern Whigs, as well as some abolitionists, although as I mentioned, abolitionists felt that these Republicans didn't go near far enough. Okay, these guys wanted to work against slavery or that sort of stuff through the channels of the government, and abolitionists wanted immediate abolition. And so there weren't a lot of abolitionists who joined this new party. But anyway, in 1854, this new party forms around the debate over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Republican Party. However, because it is a party that sort of believes in this idea of the slave power conspiracy, and one of the things this party really believes in is that slavery should not be allowed to extend to any of, they believe in Wilmot's proviso, that slavery should not be allowed to extend to any of the territories gained from the Mexican War. This party has absolutely no presence in the South. They don't have any candidates. They don't have any members in the South. They are solely sort of a northern and western party, which is a new thing in American politics, to have a party that's solely based on one section of the country. So, meanwhile, in Kansas, okay, remember, the Kansas-Nebraska just sort of invites the sort of hooligans from all sides, and that's exactly what happens. I mean, the Kansas territory, immediately after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, just becomes this sort of haven for sort of armed individuals who are intent on getting to Kansas faster with more men and more arms in order to force Kansas to go their way. And so, pro-slavery people come rushing in from Missouri and Arkansas and other places, and anti-slavery people come, rushing in from, in particular, sent by abolitionists in Massachusetts and New England to try to affect the outcome of whether Kansas will be a slave or a free state. Okay, so this then all sort of comes to a head in 1854 and 1855, in that Kansas is going to have an election. And this election is going to determine who the legislature in the territorial legislature in Kansas will be. Of course, it's that territorial legislature that's going to write the state's constitution, the state's first constitution. And so if pro-slavery people win a majority in that legislature, then obviously it's going to be a constitution that that makes slavery legal. If anti-slavery forces win a majority in that legislature, then it's going to be a constitution that outlaws slavery. And so this becomes, again, as I mentioned, the front lines in the fight for or against slavery. And you start to see, people who are pro-slavery start to attack anti-slavery settlements, and vice versa in Kansas. And you see Missourians, known as border ruffians, as Kansans, free or anti-slavery Kansans call them, come across the border and attack anti-slavery towns, and vice versa. Anti-slavery forces, who are called Jayhawkers, go across the border into Missouri and jayhawk or raid pro-slavery towns. And in particular, again, many of the people who are anti-slavery in Kansas are anti-slavery, but not necessarily abolitionists. And as I mentioned to this, many of these people come from places like Iowa and Illinois and places like that, who they have no love for African Americans. They don't really care about equality. They're against slavery because they feel like African Americans or slaves do the work that poor whites could be doing. And so therefore, what many of these people want is to outlaw slavery in Kansas, but also to outlaw blacks altogether, to not allow African Americans to live there at all. Now, in some pockets of Kansas, particularly Lawrence, where the University of Kansas is a town that's founded by abolitionists who are against slavery for moral reasons, who want immediate abolition, and who are against slavery because they feel that all men are created equal. And in fact, some of the most virulent and violent of the anti-slavery folks are the folks who come from these abolitionist backgrounds. For example, Henry Ward Beecher, who is a famous abolitionist congregational minister in New England. His wife, or his sister, is the one who writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Anyway, he sends crates to Kansas for his followers there, his anti-slavery followers, that are marked Bibles. In reality, what's in the crates are guns. And so in Kansas, sort of the slang became, Beecher's Bibles actually refers to guns, not Bibles. Anyway, the time comes then for the territorial election to occur. And before the territorial voting started, there was a census done in Kansas of how many eligible voters there were. And I think there were something like 2,000 eligible voters in the entire territory, okay? When the election results came in, there were something like 6,000 votes cast, even though there were only 2,000 people who were eligible to vote. And what had happened was, and there were numerous reports of this on Election Day, is that Missourians had come and even people from Arkansas had come across the border, people who were pro-slavery, come across the border and voted in the territorial election in Kansas. And when the election results were posted, every single pro-slavery candidate won the election. And so this legislature that is going to write the new Constitution, the Constitution is going to be the Constitution of the state of Kansas, is completely full of nothing but pro-slavery candidates because of the sort of voter fraud, mass voter fraud that went on Election Day. In response to this, and so that new legislature, the one that's elected in this sort of fraudulent election, they take up residence and start meeting in a town called Lecompton, Kansas. Okay, it's not too far from Lawrence. In response to this, the anti-slavery Kansans, who feel that this election is completely bogus, they decide to have their own legislature, and they decide to meet in Topeka, which is also an anti-slavery settlement. And so in 1855, you actually have two legislatures meeting in Kansas, both of them claiming to be the legitimate legislature of the people of Kansas. And so imagine if there was, the legislature that met in Austin and the one that for whatever reason decided to meet in San Antonio, Texas today and say that, no, we're the real legislature of Texas. Just sort of crazy situation that goes on in Kansas. And it's sort of a race against time and a race to see which one of them will get their constitution accepted by the U.S. Senate. It's the pro-slavery legislature, the Lecompton legislature, that actually gets its constitution considered by the Senate. Because what happens is, even though a lot of people agree that the election was probably